Hi, my name is Mike Kurth, and today we're going to cover the medieval guild system. This is a system that existed for 1,000 years, from approximately the 5th century until the 15th century, and the remnants of the guild system are still with us today in the form of our modern trade unions, in many of our professional organizations, such as education, medicine, the law. What we're going to focus on as we cover the guild system is the various markets for the four factors of production. And these factors are land, labor, capital, and technology. Without these, no production can take place. I would like to start with the breakup of the Roman Empire. Unlike earlier conquerors who were after plundering or seizing land, the Romans were really interested in commerce and trade. They were administrators. They built ports. They built roads. The old saying is all roads lead to Rome. The roads were like super highways at the time. They were there for moving Roman legions around quickly, but primarily they were there for commerce. It was goods and trade that moved on the roads. And at its zenith, the Roman Empire extended from northern England up near Scotland, down through Spain, France, across Italy into Romania, into through Greece and into Turkey and what was known as Persia or Iraq, Iran, Middle East, Northern Africa. A huge chunk of land, especially when you had to travel on horseback. The breakup of the Roman Empire began in the 4th century. In 326, Constantine was elected to be the new Caesar, the new emperor of Rome. Constantine had been the general of the Roman legions in Europe. And one of the unique things about Constantine was that he was married to a Turkish woman who was a baptized Christian. And at the time, the Christians were being persecuted in Rome. As Constantine was marching back to accept his election, a rival general blocked his path, and it looked like Constantine was outnumbered. And the night before the battle, he claimed to have seen a golden cross in the sky, and he ordered his troops to march under a symbol, Chi-Rho, Greek letters Chi and Rho, which stood for Christ. And they were victorious, and he marched into Rome. And one of the first things he did was he legalized Christianity. He didn't make Christianity the official religion yet, but he legalized it. And this did not sit well with all the pagan priests all across this huge Roman Empire. You had these big temples to all the pagan gods, and the priests who ran those temples, they were very powerful people. And after Christianity was legalized, Christianity increased and paganism declined, and this was not popular with those priests. The second thing that Constantine did that really upset the establishment in Rome was he announced that he was moving the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to a new city that he was building, a city that would be called Constantinople. And Constantinople is now Istanbul in Turkey. It sits on the Bosphorus Straits, a narrow waterway that separates Europe from Asia. And so what Constantine was doing was he was totally reorienting the Roman Empire. Having fought up in Europe for a decade, he was convinced that there was very little wealth in Europe. It was cold, it was barbarous, there wasn't a whole lot to be gained there. All the wealth was in the East. And so Christianity was seen as an Eastern religion. It was an offshoot of Judaism. And now he wants to move the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople. And this was just too much for the Roman establishment. And the empire split in half. So you now had two Roman empires. You had the Western Roman Empire in Rome, and you had the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. And you had two Caesars. The Roman Empire quickly fell into disarray. In 476, Rome was sacked by the Vandals, and it would never regain its glory, its power. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople continued to exist for another 1,000 years. So you had two religions. You had the Catholic Church out of Rome, but you had the Orthodox Church out of Constantinople in the east. The Eastern Roman Empire is also known as Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire. They used the Greek alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet. The Roman alphabet was used throughout Western Europe, and you kind of see the divide even today in the alphabets that they use and in the churches. Constantinople ultimately fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The leadership, the church and the political leadership, shifted up to Moscow. Tsar is a version of Caesar. In Russia, they would claim that the Roman Empire existed up until 1917. Now I'd like to turn to Western Europe and the economy there during the Middle Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire. Byzantium will come back into play during the Renaissance and after the fall of Constantinople. But when Rome fell, Western Europe quickly fell into disarray and warlordism, kind of like in Afghanistan today, where you have all these warlords fighting in different areas. And the church decided to step in and cut down on this fighting by sanctioning rulers or lords in the different areas. If you were sanctioned by the church, that meant that you were appointed by God to be the Lord Protector of that region. And this is where divine right comes in. You're ruling by divine right. And if one lord was attacked by someone who was not sanctioned by the church, then all the other warlords sanctioned by the church were supposed to come to that person's aid. So they ruled by divine right, and the people that lived in that area were told they weren't to move, that if they were born there, it was because God wanted them there, so they were tied to the land, and they were tied to that particular lord, their Lord Protector. The Lord Protector was supposed to watch over them. They were supposed to pay taxes to the Lord Protector. They're supposed to serve in his army, but he was supposed to look out for them. Well, that relationship quickly turned to where the feudal lord owned these people. They were the serfs. They were very poor and impoverished. Now, in the towns, that's where the craftsmen lived, the workers. The serfs were the peasant farmers. Now, if a serf wanted to run away, he said, my life sucks, I'm going to go to the city, I'm going to get myself a job, they wouldn't let him in. The towns were walled to protect from non-Christians. Only Christians could live in the towns. And the towns are ruled by the guilds. And the guilds were organized by craft or trade. It was kind of like our labor unions today. You had the Carpenters Guild, you had the Bricklayers Guild or Masons, you had the Goldsmiths Guild, the Bakers Guild, the Barbers Guild, and the barbers at the time were doctors. They didn't cut hair, they cut people, because they believed if you cut them and let out the bad blood, they would get better, which, by the way, is how our first American president died. He had the flu, and the doctors cut his veins to let out the bad blood, and he bled to death. There were three ranks in the guild. You had the apprentices, the journeymen, and the masters. And the apprentices were young boys, usually from 6 years old to 14 years old, and they would take an apprenticeship with a master of the guild. They would live in his house. He would feed them, clothe them, and he was to teach them the trade. So it was a real honor at that time to be taken in as an apprentice, because it meant you would be economically secure. The guilds were very prosperous. When an apprentice came of age, usually when they were 14, then they left the master's house and they became a journeyman. And as a journeyman, that meant that they could travel around, they could work on their own, they could work for other people. But one thing a journeyman couldn't do is they could not employ anyone to work with them. Only the masters could employ other workers. Now, the masters were more like labor contractors. They were the ones who organized or hired or employed the other workers. So when the feudal lords or the church wanted something built, they would go to the master of the guild and they would say, you know, we need some bricklayers, some masons, we need some carpenters, this is what we want to build. and then the masters would assemble that. So the masters had both apprentices who worked for them for free and learned, and they also hired journeymen to work on large-scale jobs with them. So masters were very prosperous. The journeymen, they did okay. They were middle class. The masters were upper class. And it was the masters who ran the towns. There was a master's council, a council of masters that ran the town with members from each of the guilds running it. So this was it was not an open city. The cities had walls around them. Only Christians could live inside those cities, and only guild members could work. To regulate this, each guild had its own distinctive hat. You've probably all seen a baker's hat, what that looks like. Well, each guild had its distinctive hat, so if you looked at someone out there on the street, you could tell that this is a bricklayer, this is a carpenter, this is a baker, whatever that profession was. And each town had its distinctive colors. And you would wear those colors while you were working so that people could tell where you were from. So if you saw someone wearing a carpenter's hat and you saw them wearing certain colors, you'd say, oh, that person's a carpenter from Hanover. And that's one way that they checked. If you went up to a carpenter from Hanover and you said, hey, how's Fred doing? And they didn't know Fred, then you took him out and strung him up from the nearest tree. And when you graduate from McNeese, you're going to participate in a medieval ceremony. You're going to put on that flat mortar board on your head. That's the academic's hat, you know, the one little tassel hanging off. You're then going to put on your medieval robe, the black gown you walk in, and you're going to put on the colors of McNeese. And when you're in a ceremony, if you look around at your professors, if a professor's from Tulane, you'll see them wearing the green and white of Tulane. If they're going to be wearing my maroon and gold from Virginia Tech. So you can look around at the different professors and see what college they went to by the colors that they're wearing. This is how it worked. So in medieval times, we saw there was no market for land because the church held that God made all the land. It was his, and it wasn't to be bought or sold. There was no market for labor because the guilds controlled the labor markets. You didn't just wake up one day and say, oh, I don't want to be a carpenter anymore, I want to be a baker or change jobs. You basically had to be born into the guild. That was the most common way to go into the guild, or apprenticed into the guild. So at this time that, for example, people's last names changed from the patronymic, like Johnson or Williamson, into craft names. You were Barber, or you were Wagner, or you were Porter, or you were Weaver. These were the names of trades that we carried, and that's because for generation after generation after generation, the family were weavers, or they were smiths, or they were carpenters. And so that actually became your last name. But there's also no market for technology. Today we talk about intellectual property rights, where if you invent something, you get a patent on it. If you write something, you can get a copyright on it. If you create some kind of image, you can get a trademark on it. But these property rights didn't exist at that time. They didn't come in until the 1600s, the late 1600s. So during this era of the guilds were very secretive, because if they invented a new process or a new technology, they had to keep it to themselves. They had to keep it secret, because if they let that secret out, other people could use that same process and compete with them. So first, there was really no incentive to come up with anything new because you didn't get a lot of reward for it. And if you did, then you had to keep it secret. You had to keep it to yourself to protect it. Now you contrast that with today, when we have established property rights to intellectual contributions. Today, if you invent something, you patent it, it's yours, you can sell it, and you become very rich. If you write a song, you can copyright it, and you can make money from that. So there's a big incentive to be innovative and creative and to develop things, create things, because you can market it. But also, once you do create it, there's a big incentive to get it out and disseminate it as widely as you can. So if you invent something and you get a patent, what you're trying to do is market it and get as many people as possible to use it. And there's a huge difference between the guilds, where there were no intellectual property rights, there was no market for technology, there was no incentive to be creative, and if you did happen to come up with some new process, almost by accident, then you kept it to yourself. You made it a big secret. So the guilds were very secretive. It's like the Masons, they were the bricklayers. They came up with a process for making mortar that was very, very strong and held these bricks together. If you go to Europe today, you can see buildings, brick buildings that were built 800,000 years ago, and they're still standing. They kept that process to themselves. If you revealed it, they would kill you. It was that simple. So one of the things that this meant was that technological progress during this time was very, very slow. Things didn't change from one generation to the next. The craftsmen were in the same family from one generation to the next. They did things the way fathers did them, and there was very little innovation. And so for 1,000 years, things didn't change much in Europe. The fourth factor of production is capital, and that can refer to the machinery, but also to the money or the financing that goes into build the machinery and build the factory. Now, in medieval times, the church held that usury, which is the lending of money at interest, is a sin. And in the Bible, if you look, there's one time when Jesus loses his cool, gets mad and violent, and that's in the temple. He overturns the tables of the money lenders and whips them. So if this is enough to get Jesus angry, it's pretty bad stuff. So the Christians can't engage in this. There was only one family in the whole Christian world that was allowed to engage in money lending. That was the Medicis in Florence. They were given a special dispensation by the Pope so that they could be the bankers for the Vatican. They were extremely powerful and extremely wealthy. But other than the Medicis, in the whole Christian world, there was no money lending or banking allowed. If you wanted to finance an operation, an expedition, you had to go to the Jewish money lenders in some of the coastal cities in Europe, like Venice and Genoa. And that when Marco Polo wanted to go to China, that's where he had to go to borrow his money to finance his expedition. Now, not only was the lending of money considered a sin, but being a merchant or engaging in trade was considered off limits for Christians. Many of the medieval churches had a passage over the doorway from the Bible that said it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of the needle than it is for merchants to get into the gates of heaven. The church looked at any profits made from trade as coming from exploiting someone else. So if a merchant became wealthy by engaging in trade, they said, ooh, look at all that money. That's a measure of how much they've exploited their fellow human beings. And for a merchant to get into heaven, they'd essentially give all their wealth to the church, and then the church would try to pray their soul into heaven. But Christians were not supposed to engage in trade. So you had these walled cities that were governed by the guilds. Only Christians could live inside those cities. Outside the city walls, you had non-Christians could live. And these areas were called ghettos. A ghetto is an area to which foreigners are restricted. And so outside the cities, you had the ghettos where the gypsies and the Jews and non-Christians lived. And they engaged in trade. They were merchants, and they were money lenders, but not inside the cities. So in medieval Europe, you had no markets for land. Land belonged to God. No markets for labor. Labor markets were controlled by the guilds. No markets for capital. Usury was a sin, not allowed for Christians. And no markets for technology. There were no intellectual property rights at all. So things stayed the same century after century for 1,000 years until the system began to break apart. That's what we'll discuss in the next lecture.